My sister didn't find those documents by accident. She was looking. She'd gone into my coat pocket, the gray wool one I'd hung on the hook by the guest bathroom. And when she came back to the Christmas table holding a folded envelope, her expression wasn't surprise. It was something I recognized from childhood. The look she got right before she won something. "What's this?" she asked, but her voice already had the answer baked in. The envelope held the closing summary for my third investment property, the one in Denver, the one that had pushed my real estate portfolio past $4.3 million that fall. I want to tell you I handled it gracefully. I want to tell you I stood up, took it calmly from her hand, and smiled. But the truth is I froze because I knew, the second I saw that paper in her fingers, exactly what was about to happen. And the worst part was that I'd spent 15 years learning to see things coming, and I still wasn't ready for this one. Before I tell you the rest, let me tell you about the house I grew up in. We lived in a narrow 2-story in rural Indiana, the kind of town where the hardware store has been in the same family since before your grandparents were born, and everyone waves even if they don't know your name. My parents were good people, in the way that people can be good and still cause damage without meaning to. They weren't cruel. They just had one daughter they worried about, and one they assumed would figure it out. My sister Amber came into the world at 31 weeks. She was small and fragile, and for a while the doctors weren't sure. When she finally came home, the whole house reorganized itself around her. My bedroom became the quiet room. My after-school noise became a problem. My presence, in the way of children who take up space, became an inconvenience nobody named directly, but everyone arranged around. I learned to exist on the edges, doing homework at the kitchen table while everyone clustered in the living room, eating a little faster so I could clear my plate and disappear before I disrupted anything. I don't say this to make her the villain. She was a baby. She had no say in any of it. But 15 years later, she was still the one who needed protecting. Amber never quite landed. She drifted through majors the way some people flip channels. First education, then fashion merchandising, then something called holistic brand consulting that lasted 1 semester and cost more than I made in 3 months at 16. Every drift cost money my parents didn't really have, and every time they called me. I'd started working at 16, hostessing at a restaurant 40 minutes from home because the one in town would have meant everyone knowing my business. The owner, a woman named Mrs. Keene, was the first adult outside my family who looked at me like I had something worth developing. She was direct without being hard, and she had a way of handing you responsibility before you thought you were ready for it, which turned out to be exactly the education I needed. She taught me how to read people, how to track what moved and what stalled, how to trust instinct when the numbers backed it up. When I saved enough to take 1 community college course in real estate fundamentals, she wrote me a letter of recommendation that I still have in a drawer. By 23, I had my license. By 26, I had my first investment property, a duplex in Columbus that I'd renovated on weekends with secondhand tools and advice from contractors who took me seriously once I stopped acting like I expected them not to. By 30, the portfolio had grown quietly, steadily, the way things grow when no one's watching and you're not stopping to explain yourself to anyone. My family didn't know the scale of it. They knew I worked in real estate. They assumed that meant I showed houses to young couples on Saturdays and lived modestly the rest of the week. My mother told her book club I was in sales, said it the way you'd say someone worked at the grocery store. Fond but incurious, not quite a compliment. My father nodded along whenever I tried to explain what a cap rate was, then pivoted to ask if I'd heard about Amber's new opportunity. I stopped explaining. I showed up at holidays. I wrote the checks when they called. They called often. The first time was 2 years ago, right after Amber's consulting thing dissolved. My mother's voice on the phone had that particular texture, the one that started soft and gathered weight as it went, like a stone rolling downhill. "Your sister is really trying, Delia. She just needs a bridge." A bridge meant $4,000. I sent it within the hour without asking what the bridge was for. The second time was 6 months after that. Amber had moved into a new apartment, and the deposit plus first month had stretched her thin. Another call, another texture, another transfer. Then it became a rhythm. Some months it was rent. Some months it was a professional development course that my parents had partially gifted her and just needed the balance covered. Once it was a car repair that turned out, when I looked at the invoice she forwarded, to be more of an upgrade than a fix. I transferred the money anyway. Not because I didn't see it. Because it was easier than the conversation none of us wanted to have. What I didn't know, what I found out in October, 2 months before Christmas, was that Amber had been telling people a different story, that I borrowed from our parents sometimes, that I was the sister who never quite found her footing, that the family kind of carried me. She'd said it casually, the way you repeat something until you forget it isn't yours to decide. One of her friends worked adjacent to someone who had nearly hired me for a consultation and had mentioned to them that I seemed like I could use the work. A colleague told me gently, watching my face for the moment I'd react. I didn't react. I thanked her and drove home in silence and sat in my car in the parking garage for 11 minutes before I trusted myself to go upstairs. By December, something in me had changed in a way I couldn't have explained clearly but could feel, the way you feel a wire pulling taut before it snaps. When my mother called about Christmas and said everyone's counting on you to make it special, I booked the flight without the usual warmth in my chest. I brought the food, as I always did, catered from a place in Indianapolis that knew how to make things look effortless. The kind of spread that makes people go quiet when they first walk into the room. My mother came through the dining room, glanced at the table, and said, "Good, Amber's going to love this." She moved on to check the centerpiece. Amber arrived last, as always, with her boyfriend and a bottle of wine she presented to my father, like she'd selected it personally at some vineyard instead of picking it up at the gas station 2 towns over. I recognized the label. She kissed my mother on the cheek. She hugged my father for a long time, the hug of someone who knows it'll be appreciated. She glanced at me across the room and said, "You look tired." I said I was fine. Dinner was going the way it always went. My father asking Amber's boyfriend about his career trajectory, in a tone he reserved for people he'd already decided were promising. My mother refilling Amber's glass before it was empty. Me answering questions about real estate in the abbreviated way I'd learned, just enough to satisfy without opening anything up, just enough to keep the conversation from going somewhere no one really wanted it to go. Then Amber excused herself to use the restroom. She was gone longer than she should have been. I noticed it the way you notice something without quite flagging it, a small gap in the room's rhythm, slightly offbeat. When she came back, she was holding the envelope. She set it on the table beside the breadbasket, slowly, and looked at me. "What's this?" she asked. The closing summary, property address, purchase price, net equity position, portfolio totals on the second page. The figure in the upper right corner, $4,312,000. "That was in my coat pocket," I said. "I was looking for a pen." She said it without blinking. "There's a pen on the side table in the hallway." She didn't answer that. My father leaned forward. My mother set her fork down. The table had gone still in the way that rooms go still when everyone's been waiting for permission to stop pretending. Amber slid the envelope forward toward the center of the table. "Delia, this says $4 million. "Yes," I said. My mother's voice came out strained. "Is this real?" "It's real." You have $4 million in properties and you never said a word to us?" "You never asked what I had," I said. "You only ever asked what I could give." My father's jaw shifted. "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" Amber tilted her head, watching me with an expression I'd seen on her face before, right before she reframed something. "You've been letting Mom and Dad think they were helping me when you were the one actually sending the money. I covered your rent, your deposit, your car, your courses, yes. Because you had it. Her voice had gone reasoning, careful. Like she was explaining something obvious to someone slow. You clearly had it. You've been sitting on $4 million while my parents worried themselves sick about whether I was going to make it. I sent the money so they wouldn't have to worry, I said. Not so you could tell people I borrowed from them. The table went very quiet. My mother looked at Amber. What is she talking about? Amber's expression shifted slightly, just enough for me to see the recalculation happening underneath. I may have. People were always asking why Mom and Dad helped me, and I didn't want to get into the details, so I said the money moved around in both directions. It wasn't a big deal. You told people I couldn't support myself, I said. I said the families supported each other. A colleague nearly didn't hire me because they thought I was financially unstable. That's not a small thing, Amber. Her chin went up. You're exaggerating. Tell me how you spent the money from last September. The month I sent $3,200 for what Mom described as an emergency. Silence. There are photos from Sedona, I said. You tagged the hotel. My mother made a sound, not quite words, somewhere between protest and acknowledgement. My father set his napkin down on the table with a precision that meant he'd made a decision about the room. Delia, you have the means to support your family. Sitting here cataloging receipts like an accountant, this isn't who we raised you to be. You raised me to be quiet, I said, not harshly, just plainly. You raised me to stay out of the way while Amber needed things, and to step up when she couldn't manage, and to do both without making it anyone else's problem. I did that, for years. I did it without complaining, and without keeping score, and in exchange, nobody at this table knew what I'd built, because nobody at this table ever thought to ask. My mother shook her head slowly. You always landed on your feet. Amber needs more support than you do. That's just the truth of who she is. That sentence landed somewhere deep and stayed there. I landed on my feet because I had to, I said. You made sure of that by making sure she always had somewhere softer to fall. You're being cruel. My mother's voice had started to waver. I'm being honest, it's different. Amber stood up. The chair scraped back and the sound cut through the room like something being punctured. You think you're so self-sufficient. You think you've done everything alone. Fine, but I'm your sister. We're supposed to. What? I asked. We're supposed to what, Amber? Show up for each other. Ask how the other person is doing. Tell the truth. I looked at her steadily. When was the last time you asked me how I was? Not what I had, not what I could cover, how I was. She didn't answer. The boyfriend had found something fascinating about the tablecloth. My father made a sound that was somewhere between a sigh and a command. If you have this kind of money, you have a responsibility to this family. I've been meeting that responsibility for 2 years without anyone acknowledging it existed, I said. And the minute you found out the number was bigger than you realized, the response wasn't pride or gratitude, it was more. I looked around the table. That tells me what I need to know. I picked up my phone. My hands were very steady, steadier than I expected them to be. I opened the banking app, found the recurring transfer, the one set up to auto-send on the 15th, canceled it, found the secondary one, the irregular one labeled for emergencies, canceled that too, confirmed both. What did you just do? Amber's voice had gone sharp. What I should have done a year ago. Delia. I'm not angry, I said, and I meant it, which surprised me almost as much as it seemed to surprise them. I'm done. Those are different things. Her face moved through several expressions. Disbelief. Then that calculating look, then something that might have actually been hurt underneath. You're going to do this on Christmas. You went through my coat on Christmas. She didn't have anything to say to that. My father said something about ingratitude. My mother said I'd regret this. Amber's boyfriend continued his close study of the tablecloth. I folded the envelope back along its original creases and slid it into my coat pocket. I took my bag from the hook by the door. I didn't hug anyone on the way out, not because I was making a point, but because no one moved toward me. They sat in their chairs around the table I'd paid to fill, and they watched me leave. The cold outside hit me immediately, clean and specific. I stood on the porch for one breath, just one, not for effect but because I needed it, one moment that was entirely mine, before I walked to my car. I drove 4 hours back to Cincinnati that night. I didn't cry until I was past the state line, and even then it wasn't the kind of crying that breaks you open. It was more like release, a slow, pressurized exhale of something I'd been holding up for a long time, without realizing how much weight it had. The messages started before I reached Columbus. My mother first, voicemails with that descending texture, each one heavier than the last. My father's texts, short at first, then longer, then pointed. Amber sent a voice message that ran almost 4 minutes and used the word unfair 6 times. I counted when I finally played it 2 days later, sitting at my kitchen table with coffee, taking notes the way my attorney had asked me to. Extended family materialized from nowhere. An aunt I hadn't spoken to in 3 years, with thoughts about obligation, a cousin who forwarded something about choosing money over blood without apparent irony. Someone had shared my number in a group chat that didn't exist the last time I'd checked. The notifications ran through the night, and I silenced my phone and went to sleep, which felt like the most subversive thing I'd ever done. In the morning, I called my attorney. She'd handled my property contracts for 4 years, precise, fast, and completely immune to drama, which made her the right person for exactly this. I forwarded everything. She went quiet on the line as she read, the particular quiet of someone who is thinking rather than reacting. Then she said, "End of day, I'll have letters ready by 5. She paused. "Are you doing okay?" I thought about it honestly before I answered. "I think I'm going to be." Amber posted something publicly 10 days after Christmas. I didn't see it directly. A colleague mentioned it, carefully, the way you raise something when you're not sure if the person already knows. It was vague enough to avoid specifics, but pointed enough to be clear. Something about abandonment, something about wounds that don't heal. It collected a lot of supportive comments from people who had never been in the same room as me. I let my attorney respond to the one that crossed a line. The rest I left where they were. What I did instead was quieter. I'd been renting in Cincinnati for 3 years, always meaning to buy something of my own and always finding a reason to defer it. In January, I stopped deferring. I bought a bungalow on a street with old trees and neighbors who knew each other's names, and I spent 3 weekends painting every room a color I'd actually chosen. Sage green in the kitchen, a warm off-white in the bedroom, a deep navy in the small study where I put my desk. The afternoon I finished the kitchen, I sat on the floor with a glass of water and looked at what I'd done and felt something I didn't have an immediate word for. Something that turned out to be ownership, not of the property, of the moment itself. Mrs. Keene came to visit in February. She was in her 70s now, had sold the restaurant 5 years back, but we still talked the way you maintain the things that shaped you. She sat at my new kitchen table and looked around the room for a long time without saying anything. "This feels like you," she finally said. "It does," I agreed. I meant it all the way down. She asked about my family the way she always did, directly, without softening it into something easier to answer. I told her what had happened, and she listened the way she always had without filling the gaps with her own reactions. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know what I always noticed about you? You never asked for credit. You just did the work and let it stand." She wrapped both hands around her mug. The hard part about that is that people start to assume the silence means they can keep taking. They stop looking for the limit because you never showed them one. I nodded. "You showed them one," she said. "That's not small." She was right. I know that now in a way I couldn't have known standing on that porch in the cold, breath clouding in the dark air, keys in my hand. Setting a limit doesn't feel like strength when you're doing it. It feels like grief, mostly, like releasing the version of things you wanted to be true. The family that would have looked up sooner, the sister who might have chosen honesty, The parents who might have been curious about both daughters instead of devoted to one. You mourn the story you'd been quietly hoping might still correct itself. But grief is not permanent if you don't build a house in it. It moves through you if you let it. Spring came to my street and the old maples got their leaves back, and I found myself sitting on the front porch in the early mornings with coffee, watching the neighborhood assemble itself. A dog walker, a kid on a bike with a wobbly back wheel, a retired couple who did the same loop every morning at exactly the same time and waved at me each pass like we were already friends. It was slow and ordinary and completely mine, in a way nothing in my life had ever quite been before. Work expanded. I took on a museum foundation looking to restructure their property holdings, and a private collector who needed precision and discretion, which I'd always been good at. I hired an assistant, a young woman right out of school who was sharp and slightly terrified of how sharp she was. I recognized that combination. I gave her responsibility before she thought she was ready, the way Mrs. Keene had given it to me. I told her once, without much preamble, while we were going over a property assessment. Don't let people confuse your capability with your availability. Being good at something doesn't mean you owe it to everyone who wants it. You're allowed to say no. You're allowed to have things that are entirely yours. She looked at me like that was new information. Maybe for her it was, I understood. It had been new information for me too, for a long time. Amber still posts. My parents still have their version of what happened, which I understand is easier than the one that requires reckoning. Some people believe them. A few have reached out to me with messages that are half concern and half reconnaissance. I respond to none of them. Not out of anger. Anger has mostly passed, the way water recedes after a flood, leaving things rearranged but no longer submerged. I just don't have anything to explain. The people who matter to me already know who I am. What I've learned, the kind of knowing that settles into the body, not just the mind, is that love and obligation are not the same thing, even when people use them interchangeably, that the ones who raised you are not automatically owed the life you built after they stopped watching, that choosing yourself isn't a betrayal, it's a decision, and decisions have their own quiet integrity that doesn't require anyone else's approval to stand. Some mornings I sit at the kitchen table and watch the light come through the window the way it only does in early spring, long and golden and particular to that hour. I think about Mrs. Keene's voice, "You just do the work and let it stand." I think about how many years I spent waiting for someone in that house in Indiana to finally look up and see what I'd built. Waiting for the acknowledgement to arrive the way you wait for a package you were never actually told was coming. I don't wait for it anymore. I let the work stand, and I let the light in, and I'm finding slowly, in the way real things take time, that this is more than enough to build a life on.